All right. Hello, everybody. We're back with another reading roundtable. I'm back with Jim Dimond. Jim, and I don't know if I mentioned this in the other ones, but Jim is also one of the progenitors of this course. So along with Dave Peloff, he was the founder of this course, really. We owe him a lot. We owe him a great debt of gratitude for putting together such a forward-thinking course and helping identify some of these great readings. And Jim, I've been kind of putting to you a lot of my questions about ways to think about some of the modeling of some of the educational assessment aspects of this course. And today we're going to be talking a little bit about Valerie Schute and the stealth assessment and computer-based games to support learning article. And so to kind of get us kind of going here, help us understand, what is the value of evaluating and assessing learning when someone's in a flow state? We talk about this in this Szymanski video a little bit. He talks a little bit about flow states and what's the value of trying to understand someone's thinking and what they're processing at that moment.
So in theory, if somebody's in a flow state, they're having an optimal experience, right? They're so lost in the task in which they're engaged, and they're existing in this space, this sort of sweet spot of balance between their existing skill set and the challenge, right? And there's always a little bit of a gap between these two things, and that when a learner or anyone is engaged in some activity that's in that sweet spot, then in theory they're in flow. And one reason we might want to assess while people are in flow states is because they're operating at their optimal capacity for some task. Right now, there's some controversy associated with this. Right, there are some who argue that we actually don't want to assess learning when people are in flow states because there are certain maybe metacognitive checks, metacognitive processes that a learner might bring into place if she's coming at a task more intentionally, more sort of self-consciously than what we see in flow. So there's back and forth in the literature on that, right? But I think what Val Schute would argue is that if we've created a game, if we've created a good educational game, then that game should facilitate the experience of flow. And if we're tracking that data, then we have data about the actions that player/learners taking in the problem space.
So really in the flow state, what we're really talking about is them being able to do directed actions and not recall through memorization necessarily.
That's right. That's
right. So it's not about generating lists of can I memorize a periodic table of elements? It's can I make a chemical?
Yeah, I mean if the task required them to go through that list, then that could be a part of the flow related activity, but probably not as
okay. Yeah. Okay. Thank you for helping us understand that. So Guy described the secret of a good immersive game is not the graphics, but the underlying architecture. And, on page, 507, can you help us understand what that meant?
So that's complicated, right? So that because a game is a system, right? So Jim G talks a lot about games as systems, and that if the parts of the system are meaningfully related, and if a player has some understanding of the parts of the system, then the experience of trying to influence the system in some way, right? You're taking actions in game because you're trying to win, or you're trying to progress, or you're trying to make something happen in the moment. Then that can be considered a very engaging, very immersive experience, right? You don't necessarily need a layer of high quality graphics put on top of that, right? I think there are plenty of pretty simple games and game systems, right? Chess, to pick an example of a board game. I mean, it can be beautiful. The pieces can be beautiful, but they can also be very, very simple, right? And perhaps not all that aesthetically pleasing, and yet the system on which the game is built can still be very engaging for a player.
Well, and in that space, what happens is what inserts itself is our imagination, right? That's where we can start imagining worlds or imagining beyond just what the chess pieces look like into the world that we're building around ourselves at that moment, right?
Depending on the player.
Yeah.
Absolutely, right, absolutely. I mean, I think there are plenty of players who are probably quite comfortable at existing at that very abstract space, right, without necessarily seeing the need to wrap
a larger narrative into
symbols
it,
or narrative around it.
Yeah. Okay, great. So evidence-centered design. We talk a lot about that concept in here, and it says it has these built-in diagnostic capabilities to evaluate a player's competency levels. And so practically, how does that work?
So evidence-centered design is basically a method for creating assessments, right? And the idea is that let's say as a test maker or as a game maker that happens to have tests embedded within it, you need to have a clear understanding of what the learning looks like, right? So you've got to be able to operationalize learning somehow. It's not enough to say, at the end of this game, students will understand X. Okay, what does understand mean? What does that look like, right? So what do we need a learner to do? And then that becomes something that we can observe and something that we can measure in all likelihood, right? Much of the time, not all of the time, but much of the time. And so evidence-centered design is a way of identifying a set of competencies, right? So again, to think at the level of the learning objectives, what do we want learners to be able to do? And then to operate at the level of, okay, so in the problem space, what is put into the problem space such that the learner or player has an opportunity to exhibit behaviors that we think are associated with the competencies, right? So competencies are abstractions, really, right? I can't give you a competency, right? But I can give you proxies, right? I can say, well, if I'm able to successfully perform a task by doing this, then we say, okay, well, that's a proxy for this competency. And so the assessment space needs to give learners opportunities to do that, right? And then there is the learner or the player, right? So what are they bringing to that task, such that when we see them exhibiting these behaviors, we can start to make some inferences about where they are on a learning progression, right? So if we think about any given learning objective or any given learning standard as a progression from sort of novice to expert, basic to advanced, simple to complex, whatever it is, right? There are spaces in between those. And in evidence-centered design, the test makers have done a lot of thinking in advance about, okay, well, what's the beginning look like? What does the middle look like? What does the expert part look like? Right? So that when we see those behaviors in a game space or in some problem space, we can make inferences about the learner's competency.
Okay. So we work for Johns Hopkins. we have a medical school here, and I like to try to make this a bit. I like to make this about something pragmatic here, and that is so. Let's talk about CPR, for example, right? Let's talk about an evidence-based design that would work around CPR. So you have a doctor who comes in, probably already knowing how to do CPR, but then all of a sudden they're given a pediatric patient, and pediatric CPR is very different than adult CPR. Just the speed, the chest compressions, the depth, and all that's different. So there's a knowledge gap that needs to be filled through an experience, through a learning experience. And what's our learning objective? To teach this person pediatric CPR. That's our goal, and we're going to know it, and we're going to measure it by, do they understand how to do the chest compressions to the appropriate depth? Do we understand how to give, when to give air, and how to check pulse and all that kind of thing in a pediatric situation? And the learning before is what they already know. What they're scaffolding on is what they already have walking in the door. And so then what we measure, right, is on a either a, we could do it in VR, we could do it on a mannequin, and then through that we measure.
That's right.
Those outcomes.
That's right. Yep.
So that would be kind of an applied example of evidence-based design in
That's
that
right.
case.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. And so, and then in games, you know what I mean? We can set up all of these different scenarios to do almost anything that we feel that needs to be measured, right? So if we need to figure out how someone needs to operate an oil rig, we could do that in a safe space without, as opposed to flying everybody over to an oil rig and figuring out how to operate the valves successfully, right?
That's right. That's right.
And then through play, reward successful behaviors.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
And because some problems can be very complex.
Yeah.
Right? And there are lots of discrete behaviors that can be associated with solving a problem that don't always maybe look like they're associated with solving a problem to begin with. But it turns out over time, maybe they are. Again, in this evidence-centered design model, in theory, if we can collect enough of that data, if we give learners / players enough opportunities to engage in those behaviors, then we can start making inferences about how successful a player is at solving a problem.
And predictive, right? If we can tell the person, using our doctor example, if our doctor is not very good at CPR, he's probably not going to do very well until that knowledge gap is closed.
Exactly right. Exactly right. Yeah.
Okay.